I am inspired both by the individuals, the human rights defenders, the people who come to the Human Rights Council to tell their stories, but also by the states who receive those stories and respond, and by the commitment of states like Iceland who have decided that they want to use their time on the Human Rights Council to good effect.
Mannréttindavaktin, Human Rights Watch, eru alþjóðleg samtök sem berjast fyrir auknum mannréttindum ásamt því að fylgjast með þróun þeirra og mannréttindabrotum allan heim. Samtökin eru óháð ríkisstjórnum og hafa aðalstöðvar í New York í Bandaríkjunum. Samtökin voru upphaflega stofnuð 1978 undir heitinu Helsinki-vaktin til að fylgjast með framferði Sovétríkjanna sem höfðu þá skrifað undir Helsinki-sáttmálann. Fleiri vaktir voru síðan stofnaðar sem fylgdust með öðrum ríkjum og árið 1988 sameinuðust þær undir núverandi heiti. Sérstaða Mannréttindavaktarinnar felst einkum í mannréttindaskýrslum sem þykja ítarlegar og áreiðanlegar vegna mikillar vinnu sem lögð í þær. Jafnrétti kynjanna, jafnrétti vegna kynhneigðar, pyntingar, notkun barna í hernaði, spilling stjórnvalda og dómskerfis eru meðal þeirra mála sem samtökin hafa verið hvað virkust. Til að ræða Mannréttindavaktina hingað kominn John Fisher, en hann stýrir vinnusamtakana í Genf gagnvart mannréttindaráði Sameinuðu þjóðanna þar í borg. So welcome, John Fisher.
Thank you.
Can I start asking you where you're from and what's your background?
Sure, I'm from New Zealand. Like Iceland, another small island nation with, I think, a good commitment to human rights. My background is in law, and I moved to Canada in my early 20s to do postgraduate work there and became more and more involved in human rights advocacy.
Why human rights?
It's a good question.
As a career?
Yeah. I think it is part of the New Zealand identity and frame of reference. We were proud that we were the first country in the world that provided women with the equal rights to vote. Also, at the time that I was growing up, I was doing volunteer work with lesbian and gay rights organizations. As a gay man, it was something that I struggled with in my youth. It was still a criminal offence in New Zealand at that time. New Zealand was quite late to decriminalise homosexuality, and so as I advanced in my legal career, I wanted to apply that learning to make the world a better place, or at least contribute to that, and that led me to human rights work.
So, Human Rights Watch has raised, of course, a lot of concerns about the status of human rights in the world. We are seeing rise of populism, more dictators, and then we see United States leaving the scene as a leading nation in that, and China is flexing its muscles. How do you see the status of human rights now?
I think it's a challenging time for all those of us who care about international human rights and the human rights framework more broadly. I mean, there have always been human rights challenges. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights grew out of the ashes of World War II, after all, and has served us very well as a founding document for the past 70 years. But what feels different now is that not only do we see aggressive human rights violations in countries around the world, the shocking war in Syria, the conflict in Yemen, Saudi Arabia becoming increasingly brazen in its violations of human rights, including killing of a journalist, detaining and torturing women for their human rights defense work, as you say, an increasingly aggressive China. But it also feels like there's a real pushback against the values that we all thought we could take for granted in the Universal Declaration, against the international human rights framework itself. So increasingly we hear autocrats around the world saying that they don't care about the international human rights framework, dismissing the work of the UN, jailing human rights defenders and others who dare to criticize them, critiquing journalists as purveyors of so-called fake news, and pushing back against truth-based research such as organizations like ours seek to carry out. So it is a time when I think the core values feel like they're under threat. And that was compounded when the United States chose to walk away from the UN Human Rights Council, which is the world's top body tasked to uphold the international human rights framework and to promote and protect human rights worldwide. The US withdrawal from the Council was the first time in the Human Rights Council's 14-year history that any state has chosen to walk away. And many feared it would be the beginning of the end, that without the US at the table, others might follow suit and the whole framework could fall apart. In fact, I think we have seen the opposite. I think instead we have seen other states step into that leadership vacuum and begin to more vigorously defend the very values that we all strive to uphold.
What should be our response? What should be the response to this development?
I think the responsibility is now on all of us, all individuals and all states who care about international human rights, to share the burden of ensuring that perpetrators are held to account, that victims of human rights violations worldwide are offered the protection that they deserve, and that we strive to maintain the integrity of the international human rights system. We were encouraged that Iceland stepped into the gap left by the United States when it withdrew from the Human Rights Council, and as a small country has been demonstrating that it is possible to make a big difference. And I think that helps to set the bar high and pave the way for others as well to consider what they can do to ensure that human rights violators are held to account.
So everyone has a responsibility.
Everyone does, yes. And I would say part of our frustration sometimes in our international human rights work is we often speak to delegates from many different governments, many of whom will agree that yes, the situation in Saudi Arabia is dire, somebody should do something about that, or who agree that China is increasingly exercising its muscle on a global scale and applying internationally the same suppression of freedom of expression that it applies to dissidents at home. But again, many states say someone should do something about that, but aren't willing to take the lead themselves. And unless states step forward and exercise leadership and responsibility, then good initiatives will never get off the ground, and that then contributes to a climate of impunity where rights violators feel that they can do what they want and won't be held to account.
Can I ask you about the United Nations Human Rights Council? What is it actually doing? Is it doing anything of a value?
We believe that the UN Human Rights Council has a vital role to play in protecting and promoting human rights. I mean, firstly, if we didn't have a Human Rights Council, then there really would be nothing, and violators of human rights would feel that they could act in complete impunity. One of the things an organization like Human Rights Watch seeks to do is to bring the violations and the violators out of the shadows and into the glare of international attention. And often it's only once a state finds itself under international scrutiny that it feels some responsibility to change its behavior, to address the root causes and concerns. I recall a few years ago there was a joint statement led by Ireland at the time on Azerbaijan, where a number of human rights defenders, journalists and others had been jailed just for critiquing the government. And in that statement, a number of the individuals were named, and within the course of the year, a number of them were released. We understand that part of the rationale for the releases was to try and avoid that international glare. Of course, it doesn't mean that the government hasn't continued with some of the areas of concern. We also saw that in relation to a number of initiatives led by Iceland at the Human Rights Council. And we were, I think, encouraged that when Iceland stepped into the vacant seat left by the US when it withdrew from the UN's human rights body, it recognized also a responsibility to address some of the human rights violations taking place in countries around the world. So, for example, at the session of the Human Rights Council that concluded very recently in March, Iceland presented a joint statement on Saudi Arabia and brought attention both to the brutal murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in their own embassy in Istanbul, as well as the detention and torture of a number of women's human rights defenders, and some of the laws that also needed reform in order to respect the international human rights framework. Since that time, Saudi Arabia has in fact released a number of the women who were named in that statement, and many of them have been brought on for trial, whereas previously they had been held for 10 months or so without any trial, without any appearance. So it shows that that kind of international scrutiny can have an impact and that the Human Rights Council has a valuable role to play. The challenge is that often these states will respond when they feel that they are under the spotlight, but once the glare of attention moves on, will revert back to their own ways or their old ways. And so for that reason, we also encourage states like Iceland to follow through on the joint statements with more formal initiatives, such as a resolution that would put in place the kind of ongoing monitoring and reporting on human rights violations in countries like Saudi Arabia and the Philippines, another country on which Iceland has led. And with those more structured formal mechanisms of the Human Rights Council bringing attention, there is a real chance to turn the corner.
Can I ask you, Iceland became a member of the Council when the United States stopped being there, and now we still have like half a year left as a member of the Council. How is Iceland doing?
Yes.
Your assessment.
Sure. And
your critical assessment.
I think there are very positive things to report. The fact that Iceland did lead on a joint statement on Saudi Arabia really brought international attention to the human rights situation in that country at a time when it was needing it most. Many countries that we spoke with agreed that something should be done but weren't willing to take the lead themselves. Many countries have bilateral relationships with Saudi Arabia. It's an oil-rich country. It invests heavily. It pushes back against its critics. That's one of the reasons it's so intolerant of those who dissent or who criticize the government, such as women's human rights defenders who find themselves in jail, such as the journalist who was murdered and dismembered in their own consulate. And so there really was a need, and at a time when nobody else was stepping up, Iceland did. So that's something to be commended. And the other thing that I thought was very powerful about the way in which Iceland led on the joint statement was it wasn't really conditional. Many states will say, well, okay, yes, we'll move forward on this initiative if we feel that enough other people are supporting us. Iceland just said, we're going to do this, who's with us? And once they make that commitment, then others do fall into line.
So you can expect small nations to contribute?
Very much so, and it's, I think it's often inspiring the extent to which small nations can make a big difference. The other thing that we're appreciative of is, I think, at a time when everyone was very depressed about the state of international human rights, and for good reason, and when that was compounded by the US walking away, there was really a feeling of despair. Is this the beginning of the end? Will other states follow suit? Will the whole framework fall apart? And instead, I think we've seen the opposite. We've seen smaller nations who care about the international framework step into that gap and demonstrate what is possible with goodwill, with vision and commitment. It also helps us in our work to go to other states and say, well, look, if Iceland is leading on the Philippines and Saudi Arabia, why can't these other states pull their weight and also lead on country initiatives? We've seen some states like Norway be very strong on a resolution on human rights defenders, Sweden on a resolution on extrajudicial executions, but shy about then applying those general principles to specific country situations.
Can I ask you that a lot of the news we hear on human rights or human rights violations are of course negative, and the picture is pretty bleak. Are you optimistic that on this work in the coming years?
I am by nature an optimist, and sometimes it can feel very difficult to maintain that approach, given just the challenging environment in which we all live. But I am inspired both by the individuals, the human rights defenders, the people who come to the Human Rights Council to tell their stories, but also by the states who receive those stories and respond. And by the commitment of states like Iceland, who have decided that they want to use their time on the Human Rights Council to good effect. And by bringing initiatives, for example, on the Philippines, for example, on Saudi Arabia, are really making a difference in the daily lives of the people who are affected by those violations, but setting the bar high for other states and demonstrating just what can be possible.
John Fisher, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.